Hey everybody, I'm just waiting for Jesse to join us. Hey,
Hi.
I'm gonna try and scoot back a little bit so my face
Me
isn't
too.
like
So I
way
don't
back.
look like big head. Oof.
Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Jesse and I are talking about allyship and holding space for grief, pain. And we were talking earlier today, Jesse, but I think that it's worth saying that I'm excited to have this conversation with you, but I'm also really nervous. And I think also I just want to be really careful, but also I'm human, right? And I'm
Yeah.
learning. And so
Yeah.
I want to put that out there before we ever start, or that I'm not an expert in this. It's just a conversation that we're having.
Yeah. I want to echo that too. And I appreciate that we were able to talk about that together too before starting. And we both had a shared sentiment of this feels nervous because we don't want to say or do anything wrong. And also it's important enough that we need to do and say something.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so that's the heart we're coming from, is we're coming here to talk because it's important enough to talk about.
Right. And so we both, for those who are joining who don't know us, we both have backgrounds in trauma and grief work. And so we're coming at this from the lens of what it means to sit and hold space with somebody who is grieving, somebody who has been wounded, and what that looks like. So why don't you talk a little bit, Jesse, about what it means to hold space, what that means to you, and how
Yeah.
you see that connected with allyship.
Yeah. Um, so holding space, right, is the idea of not only a physical space, but an emotional, spiritual, sometimes space for someone to come and exist. Holding space means less about us and more about that person that we're holding space for.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about it connected to allyship, what it means for me to hold space as a white person is to understand the privileges that I carry into a space and how I can acknowledge those internally and then hold a space for someone who might not have those privileges, and how do I sit with that person, hear their experience, validate their experience, and understand my role of a space holder. And how do I allow myself, especially as a therapist, to put the lens on that will help me see their experience in their way and not in the way that I think the experience would be, which is laced obviously in all of my own identities and privileges.
Right, right. And I agree. One of my favorite quotes about holding space is by Pema Chodron, and she says, the true compassion and holding space happens when we allow ourselves to move past what feels comfortable,
Mm,
what feels comfortable to us, and sit
right,
on the other side of that in
right,
somebody else's grief and pain without trying to take that from them,
right,
without trying to move back into our own comfortable space by trying to change their experience.
right. And I am so grateful you said that, because sometimes I can find myself wanting to ease suffering and ease pain. And the way I go about doing that is within my realm of familiarity and my realm of what helps me feel comfortable, right? And not allowing myself to meet someone else where they are. Or, I mean, I guess actually assuming at all that I could fix something.
Right,
Um, yeah.
right. Okay, so let's talk about allyship then.
Yeah.
I think for me this is a space and place that I have been working toward, and I'm trying to fit and fill in that space. But I'm also learning so much, right? I mean, I think the definition of privilege is that most of these experiences that other people have had, I have the privilege of choosing to educate myself about or not. It's not my lived
Yeah.
experience. And so allyship for me is looking like education
Mm-hmm.
first.
Mm-hmm.
And let's talk about that education, because there's a way to process and educate ourselves within this without expectation that people do that for us.
Right. And so when we're talking about especially allyship as white people for people of color, one of the things that's important to think about, and you and I have talked about this, is education cannot be the burden of the person of color in our lives, right? Or the people of color in our lives. We can't burden them with educating us on top of experiencing the structural oppression that exists, right? On top of having those experiences, then saying, teach me how to be better. Ask someone to pull out of their own experience of maybe even coping or just trying to survive what's happening for them in a global context, to then give us, you know, words of wisdom or inspiration. And that in and of itself, of feeling like I can go and just ask questions and this person of course would be willing to answer, is privileged, right? Just like you said, we can choose to kind of engage in this education if we want to, and we can also turn around and not have to acknowledge this at all if we didn't want to.
Right.
And that's the definition of what our privilege offers us, right? Is the ability to not have to notice we have it.
Right. And if we step back and we use that lens, right, that we have as a therapist, and let's use the lens of grief or of trauma.
Yeah.
If I am talking to a client, and they are telling me their experience, it is not helpful or effective for me to then tell them my experience and ask them to explain that my experience within the context of their life.
Yeah.
And that we're talking about the same thing, right? It's our job to look at ourselves, to uncover those things that we haven't seen or have chosen not to see, and then educate ourselves. What does this mean? How has it impacted the way that I move through the world, and how do I want to change it?
Right. And I think I believe it's our responsibility to do that work together as privileged individuals, to challenge one another and to create spaces where that's part of the dialogue, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you brought up a good point. What is it to challenge, right? Because I think all of us who have engaged in social media, who are just looking on social media, see, I think, well-meaning people challenging each other, but it often comes across very confrontational and very shaming. And so let's talk about how we change and how we challenge beliefs, how we challenge ways of thinking, but how we do that in a way that inspires change rather than forces change.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, as we talk about this, I keep thinking of the idea that shaming people for how they're trying to be an ally is not any better than what we're trying to protest and be up against right now anyways. And so as we invite movement and as we invite change, we can't tell some people they're not allowed, right? We can't create filters that don't allow everyone access to trying to see how they can be part of change happening. And so the idea of challenging one another looks like, have you considered this? Have you thought about this? Because one thing is for sure is when we shame someone, their behavior may change, but their heart won't change.
Right.
They'll just leave the conversation, right? They'll leave the space. Or if we say, if you're not who I want you to be in this allyship, I'm going to remove myself. We may be removing the only clear messages or the only contradictory messages to what they've grown up with and what they've learned so far. And so I think we'll talk about the idea of waking up. But one of the things that's so important is we have, a close friend of mine described it today as different eras of growth, and different people are in different eras. And we have to allow ourselves and others who are doing this work to be in the era that they're in and help usher them forward so that we can all move forward.
Right. Right. And we can add that idea of like what it means to be woke. And all of us want to believe that we are, but really truly we're all in different stages of waking up.
Right.
Right. And so to tell someone that they didn't wake up early enough is not only unhelpful, but we're removing potential allies and potential
Yes.
help and friends, and we're removing extra voices for change. And so I think we need to be really gentle as we challenge. And there are really helpful ways to challenge by saying, I think I understand what you're trying to say, but can you help me understand a little bit more? Or
Yeah.
what did you mean when you said this and that? Or I understand the sentiment, but can you help me understand what you're trying to talk about here? I think there are lots of ways to challenge, but also do that with assuming that people have good intentions, and that we're all in those different stages of waking up.
And I think too, the idea of, we used this phrasing before of there's different lanes for how this change is going to happen, and it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And there are different lanes that we can all exist in. And the point is that we're moving forward.
Right.
And so if my change and if my allyship looks a certain way, help by being curious about what that looks like, instead of holding it up against your own allyship and seeing if I measure up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can we challenge each other in saying, how are you finding your voice here, and how are you finding your space here as you move forward? What do you need in order to do that? Can I support or assist you in that, instead of making this a one-way street?
Right. And understanding that the most powerful work that happens within us. It's in the quiet places of our heart that the most powerful work happens. And
Yeah.
so I've seen words, like virtue signaling and the idea of being woke and all of these things. And we need to remember that all of those, that idea of virtue signaling, or that idea of performative advocating activism.
Allyship,
Right,
performative. Yeah.
right. So those are there for us to check ourselves, not to check other people. We don't know what's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah. Well, and let's be really honest here that this is new for many of us as white folks, because we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the fact that a global pandemic has quieted our lives enough that we actually are seeing what the oppressed are experiencing.
Yes.
And if we don't be real about that, like, I'm glad it's happening, and the change that is being affected, I welcome with open arms. But let's be real about the fact that this is happening in a time where it's harder to distract and hide within our own privilege. We have to look at things now because we're stuck, right? And it's a perfect storm for things to occur. But let's be honest about where our hearts are at, and try to have them aligned and moving from an empowered place.
Right. Talk a little bit more about what you mean by having our hearts aligned.
Yeah. I learned long ago that racism doesn't require hatred in the heart, right? Racism happens in a lot of different places, and in microaggressions, macroaggressions, intentionally, unintentionally. And so to think, well, my heart is clean, I have a good heart, there's no way I'm acting in this way, is pretty ignorant, right? But what we're looking at is, what's your intention in what you're doing? Where is your heart aligned? Is your heart aligned to make change, right? So that equity exists in this world. Is your heart aligned for restoration and redemption? Or is your heart aligned to fit in with what's going on right now? Or is your heart aligned because it's cool right now to use certain hashtags? Like, I'm glad you're here and you're welcome here, but also check your heart and see and ask to, right? Like, search your own heart. What am I dealing with? And what are some of the barriers I inherently have, right? What are some implicit biases that I might be struggling with? And that hard work you talked about.
Yes, the hard work of love, right? It's the hard work of love, and it's the hard work of holding space for other people to look deeply at ourselves and what we have internalized. I've over and over the last week, I've heard people say, well, I wasn't raised in a racist family, so I don't have to worry about this. And that's just, it's it's I, it's short-sighted.
Well, and even if we weren't raised in a racist family, we are all raised in a racist society.
Yes,
We're
exactly.
raised in a structure, right?
Yes, we've all been part of institutions and systems that were racist, and I think the important thing to remember is systemic racism isn't about the individual, it's about the system, and those systems have informed who we are, and they have informed how we move through the world and how we see people, and the hard and holy work of change starts with us and being able to open ourselves up enough and to examine, why do I think this way? Why is that the first image that comes to my mind when I think of this thing or that thing?
Right.
Because it's it's not that there's a fundamental flaw with you. It's that
Right.
you grew up in a system and these things weren't what you asked for and you didn't ask to hold them, but nevertheless, we've been holding them.
Well, and to your point too, Brooke, like what has been learned can be unlearned. What has been learned, right? And so just because we've existed in this space doesn't mean we have to stay there.
Right.
And the hard work of love, right? Like what a beautiful phrase that is. The hard work of love also doesn't include measuring each other, right? It means holding space for each other to grow and to move and to shift and to come closer and closer to light
Right.
and equity, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's so Father Greg Boyle, who's one of my heroes in his work of compassion and work of like breaking down boundaries and barriers. His one of the things that he says is true compassion is not between the wounded and the healer, it's between two equals moving toward each other.
Yeah.
And I love that so much. But in order to do that, we have to be able to see ourselves also as wounded and move toward each other.
Yeah. And to not stay stuck in the place of self-serving guilt, right?
Mm.
Once you notice and once you recognize, just move with it.
Yes.
Notice it, observe it, and then move towards action and betterment.
Yes. Yeah. All right. We've taken lots of time, and I always love talking to you and could talk to you forever. But let's talk about resources. Let's talk about maybe what we're doing as we're in this process of waking up. Like I said at the beginning, we're not experts in this. We are on the same path.
Yeah.
And so, what is it that you're doing? What's the hard and holy work of love what's your lane?
Yeah. So my lane, I love that. My lane has been to not turn my eyes away from pain. And I have the privilege to be able to do so if I choose, and I'm going to choose not to because there's people in my world and in the world who can't get out from under that right now. And so it's my job to take the load onto my shoulders now and to let those who've carried it for far, far too long unload it, right? And rest. And so I'm looking at things and I'm learning things and I'm investigating things and I'm doing quiet internal prayerful and mindful work about what my heart looks like and about what my world and connections look like. And I'm trying to learn from sources and I'm having conversations with other white people so that my education in this is not a burden of the people of color in my life. And I'm working really hard to not be performative in what I'm doing or to share these things with the people of color in my life in an effort to make sure they know I'm one of the good ones. I'm really checking my own crap and I'm really trying to engage in this in an honest and brave way, understanding like we talked about before that I will make mistakes and it's about how do I come back and still stay in the good fight.
Yeah.
Tell me what your lane is.
So my lane has a lot to do with kind of pulling apart the the things that have been handed to me that I maybe didn't know that I had. It's about making sure that my social media feeds have more people of color in them, and that I'm listening to those voices, and that I am not just listening, but that I'm taking what they say and I'm applying it to, like, how have I added to this, or how have I contributed? Or how have I benefited in ways that I didn't even realize I was benefiting. So some of that. And then for me, my lane is talking to my kids. My lane is about kind of exposing those parts of me to them, so that they can start to do the hard work of looking at those parts that are in them.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
All right.
Should we talk about the podcast we watched really quick, or
Yes.
listened to?
Yes. Yeah.
So resource-wise, I have it pulled up, the On Being podcast with Krista Tippett. She had on her show Resma Menakem, and he's a therapist in Minneapolis, and they talk about trauma through the lens of racial oppression. And it is, if you're a therapist or anybody in the helping field, this is a non-negotiable, mind-blowing podcast to listen to. And then one thing I love about you, Brooke, is you love Audible, right? So there's so many. Just text Brooke and she'll send you a free book if she hasn't yet. But there's so many of the books right now, like White Fragility, are sold out, and which is fantastic, right? But a way to access them still would be through Audible. And then I think too, we can probably, if you choose to post resources through Riverbend, I know one of our colleagues had sent you a resource list, I think, right?
Yeah,
so
and we'll be posting that. Yeah, we'll be posting that so that that's on there. And anybody who's watching, if you have good resources, if you have something that's been really helpful to you, we would love to see it. You can DM me, and would really,
Stamped from the beginning. Do you see that?
Yeah, it's on Spotify for free right now.
Thank you, Latika.
And that's
cool.
Yeah, and also by the same author is How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is a fantastic, fantastic book. Yeah. So, all right.
This is
Thank
great.
you so much. Thanks for being here. Thanks everybody for joining us. We will post the podcast. Yes, the podcast we will post, and we'll post all the resources as well. So anyway, Thanks, Jessie, as always.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.
Love you too.
All right.
I'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.